continue with the next part, which is going into view territory. Creating an application, the first section of the essentials of view. We are again seeing everything as it would show with the composition API. We can switch to options API with this toggle, but we'll keep for all this read through with the composition API because that's the new cool guy in the building and we love it. The application instance. Every view application starts with creating a new application instance with the create app function. Okay. And if I click here, I guess it goes to the docs of that function. Yeah, it goes to the API docs for this function. We can see that creates an application instance. It's a type function. It takes arguments of component and optional object props and returns an app. Okay. So we use this, we import it from view. Get used to seeing things being imported from view because it happens all the time. And we create the app by running this function and wrapping and passing to it an argument with root component options. Okay, it could be just like a data option which returns a reactive property, for example. So, okay, that's the application instance. This is the application instance. We run this function, we create an instance of the app. Cool. The root component. The object we are passing into create app is in fact a component. Every app requires a root component that can contain other components as its children. It makes sense. So the entire view app is like a tree of components and every tree needs a root. If you're using single file components, we typically import the root component from another file. So we do import create app from view, and then we import the app from app.view, and that would be the root component, and we use it and create React app like that, and we get our component, our view instance, our app instance. Yes, while many examples in this guide only need a single component, most real applications are organized into a tree of nested, reusable components. For example, a to-do applications component tree might look like this. We have an app, which is the root component, and then we have two children inside this app, two direct children. To-do list and to-do footer. And inside to-do list, we have further children and so on. And we don't see it here, but we could reuse to-do item multiple times inside the to-do list. Like there is also this reusable keyword here. It means that every one of these components can be used multiple times inside the application. So there is a root, there are nested components inside this root, like a tree, and these components are reusable. Like a tree can have many leaves, this app can have many to-do items. We will discuss how to define and compose. We will discuss how to define and compose multiple components together in late sections of the guide. Before that, we will focus on what happens inside a single component. Mounting the app. An application instance won't render anything until it is mount. Oh gosh. An application instance won't render anything until it is mount, until its mount method is called. It expects a container argument, which can either be an actual DOM element or a selector string. So we have this element with an ID of app, and then we have to call on the app instance the mount method, and we pass in the app, well, this selector. This is a CSS selector, and it selects the element with the ID app. As you probably know, this hash means that this thing is an ID. And here it says also expects a container argument, which can be either an actual DOM element or a selector. So this could be also a DOM element. All right, maybe we see an example later. The content of the app's root component will be rendered inside the container element. The container element itself is not considered part of the app. The mount method should always be called after all app configurations and asset registrations are done. Also note that its return value, unlike the asset registration methods, is the root component instance instead of the application instance. Okay, so this thing returns the instance of the root component, not the application. Why? Okay, well, let's go with this. In DOM root component template, I guess you know what the DOM is, right? It's the document object model. It represents the tree of elements that make up an HTML. In DOM root component template, when using Vue without a build step, we can write our root components template directly inside the mount container. Oh yeah, sure, okay. So we have the same as before. We have this div with ID app. In the script, we are having our app. We get an instance of the app with some data, and then we call the mount method on the hash app, which is the ID with value app. So this thing. But here the difference is telling us when using Vue without a build step, we have here, it's basically telling us we can define the root component directly inside the HTML instead of having it in the app instance. Okay, sure. All right. Vue will automatically use the container's inner HTML as a template if the root component does not already have a template option. Okay, so if this Vue instance, if this app instance has a template option, this won't be used. This will be replaced by the content of the template. All right. App configurations. The application instance exposes a .config object that allows us to configure a few app level options. For example, defining an app level error handler that captures errors from all descendants components. So if we have this app thing exposes a config property, and this config property, we can do several things with this. One example of these things is having an error handler that will capture all errors thrown by descendant components of this app. So not of the root, as I understand correctly. This will not capture errors from the root component, but from the children of the root. The application instance also provides a few methods for registering app scoped assets. For example, registering a component. Okay, we can register components in the app instance with the component method, and we do it like this: the component name and then the component itself. This makes the to-do delete button available for use anywhere in our app. I think this is just global component registration. Well, this is basically what it says here. We can use this thing anywhere in our app if we do that. We will discuss registration of components and other types of assets in later sections of the guide. You can also browse the full list of application instance APIs in its API reference. Okay, so if we go here, we have the application API. It has all this stuff. Mount and mount provide component, directive, use, mixin, version, config. What is version? Provides the version of view that the application was created with. Okay, so it can be 3, for example. Config, error handler, warn handler, performance. Set this to true to enable component init, compile, render, and patch performance tracing in the browser. DevTool performance timeline panel. Interesting. So this is for debugging, for performance. Okay, sure. Compiler options, global properties, and option merge strategies. Well, I know what global properties are. If we want to add a value reactive property, I think, which is accessible from any component, we can add it in here. So, example of usage, we have global properties.msh message equals hello, and then we can access this from any component template with a this apparently, this like this message. Okay, fine, cool. So this app has a bunch of methods and properties. Make sure to apply all app configurations before mounting the app. Sure, before calling the mount method, we need to like do this stuff on the rest of the things and register components. So the mounts, using the mount method is the last thing. All right, multiple application instances. You are not limited to a single application instance on the same page. The Create App API allows multiple view applications to coexist on the same page, each with its own scope for configuration and global assets. So we can have an app 1 and an app 2, and each of those creates a different app and can be mounted at different points. This is really cool. If you're using Vue to enhance server-rendered HTML and only need Vue to control specific parts of a large page, avoid mounting a single Vue application instance on the entire page. Instead, create multiple small application instances and mount them on the elements they are responsible for. This is really kind of cool because then we can, we have some server running here. We have, let's close this thing. Then we had an example of some simple Vue setup here. And then we also had some server running with npx serve. We have server running in the localhost 3000, which is just some count. It's not even reactive. And then here we have a script that imports Vue with the import map, and then some script of type module which imports some my component and then mounts it, creates an app and then mounts it. So we are going to kind of play around with this to see this cool thing. Let's rename this to my component. No, wait, let's actually do something cool. Let's do here add a button which on click calls count plus plus. Will this work? I think it should kind of work, right? Count, yeah, it does work. All right, and cool. And this value is scoped to this component. So let's go here and let's do now some fancy stuff. Let's copy this And let's do this. And let's write some static content. And then we have this app1 and app2. And then we're gonna do this. Simply this. Simple. Easy and simple. We have this thing now. You see what's going on, right? We have 2 entry points for view. And then we have 2 apps. And these 2 apps are mounting the same and are using and mounting the same component, but in 2 different instances. So if we save this thing and we go here, we have 2 buttons. This is one view app, this is another view app. And if we click here, the value of this thing, the count, is decoupled from this thing because it's different instances. So yeah, that's very cool. And this is just some plain good old HTML, which is completely static and can be served from any server like this directly. Cool. Nice stuff. Nice stuff. I like it. Okay, next thing is the template syntax. Template syntax. View A. Welcome to the stream. Wow, 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 my first viewer. Thank you for being there. Anyway, let's continue with this, shall we? What is template syntax? Vue uses an HTML-based template syntax that allows you to declaratively bind the rendered DOM to the underlying component instance data. All Vue templates are syntactically valid HTML that can be parsed by spec-compliant browsers and HTML parsers. Under the hood, Vue compiles the templates into highly optimized JavaScript code. Combined with the reactivity system, Vue is able to intelligently figure out the minimal number of components to re-render and apply the minimal amount of DOM manipulations when the app state changes. If you are familiar with virtual DOM concepts and prefer the raw power of JavaScript, you can also directly write render functions instead of templates with optional JSX support. However, do note that they do not enjoy the same level of compile time optimizations as templates. So yeah, this is very cool. This is what makes Vue really cool. We can use things that look almost like plain HTML, but they are reactive to the data that we define in the scripts. And that F rocks. That was a mouthful, to be honest. I wouldn't blame you for not having no idea what I just said. I only know it because, well, I mean, I use Vue. So, yep, you can use Vue you can use the template in Vue, which is, as it says here, is valid HTML, the content of the template, but you can also use render functions to define your markup entirely with JavaScript. So, flexibility and also coolness. Text interpolation. The most basic form of data binding is text interpolation using the mustache syntax. And it's mustache because, well, I mean, if you look at this thing, it kind of looks like a mustache, right? The mustache syntax is apparently related to the double curly braces, not one curly brace, but double curly brace. And well, you have your plain HTML, except that this thing it's like, if you only knew HTML, you would look at that and think like, hey, what is this thing? That's strange. And that's what it says text interpolation. So this is like a JavaScript variable plugged into your HTML. The mustache tag will be replaced with a value of the message property from the corresponding component instance. It will also be updated whenever the message property changes. There's nothing special about message. This is just like a arbitrary name for a JavaScript variable. It could be count, it could be Pikachu, it could be whatever. Raw HTML. The double mustaches interprets the data as plain text, not HTML. In order to output real HTML, you will need to use the vHTML directive. This is very good because it's much safer than just enabling variables to be HTML and rendering that as HTML. That's dangerous because this data could have data coming from the user or from who knows where, and this could lead to problems. This is, as I see, specified here. So basically what you see here, we have some raw HTML. This is interpolated with this mustache syntax. And if we look at how this is rendered, it's not rendered as HTML, it's rendered as plain text. This is what you would see in the browser if this was like span style, blah, 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 like raw HTML, basically. If you actually want to parse this as HTML, you need to do this. You need to use this vHTML directive and pass this value in. This is nothing new. This is the same as was done before in Vue 2. Here we are encountering something new. The vHTML attribute you're seeing is called a directive. Directives. By the way, if directive sounds like Star Trek to you, well, we are the same there. First time I saw directive is like, the prime directive. Directives are prefixed with v to indicate that they are special attributes provided by Vue. And as you may have guessed, they apply special reactive behavior to the rendered DOM. Here we are saying basically, keep these elements inner HTML up to date with the raw HTML property on the current active instance. So that means this thing is reactive. If this comes from the JavaScript, so to say, if in the JavaScript, in the code, this thing changes the value, then this will be updated. So this will be updated. So if in the JavaScript we change this value from red to green, this will become green, so to say. This is very cool. I mean, this is like very powerful. Yeah, where was I? The contents of the span will be replaced with the value of the raw HTML property. Interpreted as plain HTML, data bindings are ignored. Note that you cannot use vHTML to compose template partials because Vue is not a string-based templating engine. Instead, components are preferred as the fundamental unit for UI reuse and composition. I think what it says here is that you cannot, if you pass a template, like a Vue template, to this vHTML, that won't be parsed as a Vue template. The renderer will try to parse that as plain HTML. So that's not working. You cannot, whatever you pass to this guy needs to be just kind of pure HTML. You cannot pass Vue stuff in here. Okay, and then security warning. This is very important. Dynamically rendering arbitrary HTML on your website can be very dangerous because it can easily lead to cross-site scripting vulnerabilities. Only use vHTML on trusted content and never on user-provided content. That's super, 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 and let me say it again, super important. Don't just blindly and randomly use vHTML. Only use this if you know for sure what is gonna be there, because you decided, because like basically, how to say it, if there is a chance that the content of the VHTML, well, the thing is passed in, the raw HTML is something that the users can manipulate or third parties can manipulate, try to avoid it. And if you have no choice, sanitize that raw HTML before passing it in, because that's, well, what this thing is doing is basically, I have this HTML, please render it without sanitizing, because Vue by default sanitizes HTML. Well, not even sanitizes, it parses it as a string. It doesn't try to understand this as an HTML. It's super important, super duper important. Don't just blindly use this VHTML. All right, side note aside, let's continue. Attribute bindings. Mustaches cannot be used inside HTML attributes. Instead, use a bbind directive. Yep, okay, yeah. So if we want to have some reactive data inside an attribute, instead of the mustache, we use this thing. Bbinds. Basically, here we are making the ID of this div dynamic and depending on some variable, some dynamic variable, dynamic ID. So the way we do it is bbind colon and then ID. That's nothing new. It's been there since the beginning of Vue, since the beginning of the ages, since the first age of the sun and the moon and the two trees. Stop me there, right? Stop me there. All right. The bbind directive instructs Vue to keep the element's ID attribute in sync with the component's dynamic property. If the bound value is null or undefined, then the attribute will be removed from the render tree. It's very cool. Okay, shorthand. Because bbind is so commonly used, it has a dedicated shorthand syntax, which is basically adding this colon. If we add this colon in front of an attribute, it means it can access Vue stuff. Attributes that start with colon may look a bit different from normal HTML, but it is in fact a valid character for attribute names. And all Vue supported browsers can parse it correctly. In addition, they do not appear in the final rendered markup. The shorthand syntax is optional, but you will likely appreciate it when you learn more about its usage later. For the rest of the guide, we will be using the shorthand syntax in code examples, as that's the most common usage for Vue developers. Sure, well, what it says here, it is in fact a valid character, blah, blah. They do not appear in the final rendered markup. So let's go to our example for a second. Here we are gonna go into the components, and then we're gonna add some ID to the button using some of this syntax. Dynamic ID is gonna be my button. If I can ever type my button, my button, dynamic ID. There you go. Let's grab this dynamic ID. We put it here. We've added this column here, right? You remember this column makes this value come from Vue, from this dynamic data. We save this thing, and then if we go here to the thing where we have it open, we re-render. Well, nothing happened because we just changed the ID. If we look here, well, we'll run into a problem. But okay, there you go. Here we see button ID, my button. Perfect. And if we go here, my buttons, we save it like this, we re-render. There you go, my buttons. So that's the same value as we had. It's not dynamic ID, it's this thing, which is the value of dynamic ID. And what it says here is that if you look at the button here, it's not having the colon any longer. It's being parsed and rendered as an ID, as a regular, like the common ID in HTML. That's what it means by by when it says they do not appear in the final rendered markup. That they do not appear. They are substituted by IDs. All right, Boolean attributes. That's an interesting one. Boolean attributes are attributes that can indicate true, false values by its presence or on an element. For example, disabled is one of the most commonly used Boolean attributes. vbind works a bit differently in this case. We have a button with a disabled attribute which is bound by this column, which with a value is button disabled. The disabled attribute will be included if isButtonDisabled has a truthy value. It will also be included if the value is an empty string. Maintaining consistency with buttonDisabled, for other falsy values, the attribute will be omitted. Alright, interesting. That's an interesting thing to know, actually. An empty string is, let's actually, yeah, we have the console here, it's enough. It's kind of annoying that there is so much white in here. We have an empty string, right? This is an empty string. An empty string, if we coalesce, wait, it's coalesce, I think it's coalesce, the name I'm looking for is coalesce. If we turn it into a Boolean, it's false. So an empty string is falsy, but it's very interesting. What it's saying here is that every falsy value will make this disabled attribute be omitted except for the empty string. An empty string is falsy, but it won't make it be omitted. That's very interesting. I didn't know that. I did not know that. All right. So I'd maybe recommend doing something like, you know, if you have this HTML, I'm making this is not view, so I'm making it up. So if you have this column disabled, and we had an empty string here is disabled, we had something like this. If this was an empty string, that would be then still adding this attribute. So we may want to do something like this, like explicitly convert this into a Boolean, or what is the same, this. We may want to do that for, like, you know, to avoid gotchas. So dynamically binding, oh, my voice is breaking already. Dynamically binding multiple attributes. If you have a JavaScript object representing multiple attributes that looks like this, object of attributes, ID, class. So we have multiple things inside an object. You can bind them to a single element by using vbind without an argument, like this. This is quite amazing because, well, I mean, think about this for a second. This means that if you have an element with lots of attributes, you can define them all the attributes in a JavaScript object and just bind the JavaScript object with all the attributes here, and this element will automatically gain all those attributes. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's very useful. That's imagine you have, like, I don't know, 8 attributes here. If you can bind them all, these 8 attributes, with these, you can reduce the amount of HTML visually by a lot in there, by moving logic into your script. That's very beautiful. That's amazing. It's an amazing feature of Vue. Using JavaScript expressions. So far, we've only been binding to simple property keys in our templates. But Vue actually supports the full power of JavaScript expressions inside all data bindings. So yeah, you can use JavaScript expressions inside the mustache and inside these reactive attributes. These expressions will be evaluated as JavaScript in the data scope of the current component instance. In Vue templates, JavaScript expressions can be used in the following positions: inside text interpolations, mustaches, and in the attribute value of any Vue directives. So any attribute that starts with V then dash, or it may be a shorthand for example this. This is a shorthand for V bind. Expressions only. Yeah, important. Each binding can only contain one single expression. So the following will not work. That's not an expression, that's an assignment, or a statement. So you cannot add this inside a mustache. And this is an if, it's not an expression, so no, cannot work. If you want to have conditional inside here, as it says here, use a ternary expression. So basically, this is a flow. This is a code with a flow. Yeah, flow control, exactly. An expression is anything that returns a value. Anything that when you run it, ultimately returns a value. 1 is an expression, 1 plus 1 is an expression, a plus b is an expression, and so on. This is not an expression because it doesn't return a value. It does more things. It assigns a value to a variable. This is not an expression because it has some conditional flow here. So only expressions. Calling functions. It is possible to call a component exposed method inside a binding function. Yeah, a binding expression. So your Vue data can expose functions, and they can be called from inside the mustache and the bound attributes. Tip: functions called inside binding expressions will be called every time the component updates, so they should not have any side effects such as changing data or triggering asynchronous operations. Okay. So what it's essentially saying is that any methods called inside the template should be read-only, pure functions. Restricted globals access. Template expressions are sandboxed and only have access to a restricted list of globals. The list exposes commonly used built-in globals such as math and date. Wow, okay, I didn't know that, man. I didn't know you could access math inside the template expressions. On the other hand, why not? I mean, math is a built-in JavaScript object. Globals not explicitly included in the list. For example, user-attached properties on window will not be accessible in template expressions. You can, however, explicitly define additional globals for all Vue expressions by adding them to app-config global properties. Okay, so if I go here and let's call it const app1, and then we do app1.mount, and then const app2. I never done that. That's why I kind of want to try. App2. That's the same we had so far. And then it's telling us we can use, for example, app1.global. No, config global. I don't remember. config global properties. Global properties. Then here we can add expressions to this thing. Like if I add a variable called my name and make it equal to Luis, and it's inside app1, then this thing is telling me I can access this thing directly from the app. Actually, I will leave it here. I'll go to my component, and here it's telling me let's add here div, and we put it here like that. It's telling me I can have access to this thing globally defined, apparently, if I understood correctly. Yeah, there you go. There you go. Okay. Yeah, that's how it works. And also, I was surprised from this. I mean, why should I be surprised? But I never tried to use math inside a template. Cool stuff. Directives. Directives are special attributes with a V prefix. View properties are View provides a number of built-in directives, including vHTML and vbind, which we have introduced above. Directive attribute values are expected to be single JavaScript expressions, with the exception of v-for, v-on, and v-slot, which will be discussed in their respective sections later. A directive's job is to reactively apply updates to the DOM when the value of its expression changes. Take v-if as an example. We have a paragraph with a v-if directive which equals sin, which says now you see me. Here the v-if directive would insert the paragraph element based on the truthiness of the value of the expressions sin. So if sin is truthy, this will be shown. This will be rendered. If sin is falsy, this will not be rendered. Like not even display none as a CSS style. It won't be even rendered at all. Arguments. Some directives can take an argument, denoted by a colon after the directive name. For example, the vbind directive is used to reactively update a HTML attribute. We have this vbind, and then it takes an argument, in this case href. Href is usually like, your typical string, which could be https://google.com, and that would be a link to Google. And so we can define dynamic links which depend on our reactive data like this. This href is reactive because we added this vbind property, or this vbind directive. And this is the argument. So directive, argument. And some directives take arguments. There is also this shorthand. We have seen this. Here href is the argument which tells the vbind directive to bind the element's href attribute to the value of the expression URL. Binds this value to this thing, to this attribute. In the shorthand, everything before the argument is condensed into a single character. Another example is the v-on directive, which listens to DOM events. Listens to DOM events. For example, a link with a v-on click, and then it's bound to this method do something, this function do something. This just means that when we click this link, we'll run this code, this function. And then we have a shorthand for v-on. This v-on has this shorthand at. So it's very readable because it basically says anchor or link at click or on click do something. At click do something. Here the argument is the event name to listen to. Click. The event name, click. So on click, run this. v-on is one of the few directives that also have a corresponding shorthand, with its shorthand character being at. We will talk about event handling in more detail too. Dynamic arguments. It is also possible to use a JavaScript expression in a directive argument by wrapping it with square brackets. Okay, interesting. Note that there are some constraints to the argument expression, as explained by the dynamic argument expression constraint section below. I've never done this thing. That's really, really useful. Yep, that's really cool. Yeah, I'm gonna copy this thing because it's really something I see myself using. Okay, here attribute name will be dynamically evaluated as a JavaScript expression, and its evaluated name value will be used as the final value for the argument. For example, if your component instance has a data property attribute name whose value is href, then this binding will be equivalent to bbindRef. Similarly, you can use dynamic arguments to bind a handler to a dynamic event name. Oh man, that's super useful, because then that means this could be a link. We can define different interactions in here. In this example, when event name's value is focus, bOnEventName will be equivalent to bOnFocus. Dynamic argument value constraints. Dynamic arguments are expected to evaluate to a string, with the exception of null. The special value null can be used to explicitly remove the binding. Any other non-string value will trigger a warning. Okay, so if this was null, this entire thing would be removed. That's very interesting. Let me make a note of that. If event name in this case was null, the entire attribute would be removed. Dynamic argument syntax constraints. Dynamic argument expressions has some syntax constraints because certain characters such as spaces and quotes are invalid inside HTML attribute names. For example, the following is invalid. We're binding an attribute with this name. And this triggers a warning because there are spaces here, I think. If you need to pass a complex dynamic argument, it's probably better to use a computed property, which we'll cover shortly. Sure. So let's not. Basically, the short story is don't try to do fancy things in here. Don't get crazy. Just create a property and plug it in here and let that property have the value that you need to have, but not here, like outside. Use a computed property, basically. When using in-DOM templates directly written in an HTML file, you should also avoid naming keys with uppercase characters, as browsers will coerce attribute names into lowercase. Okay, interesting. The above will be converted to SOMAT in DOM templates. If your component has a SOMAT property instead of SOMAT, your code won't work. Interesting. Wait. Yeah, in DOM templates. Sure. Templates directly written in an HTML file. So if I had basically returning to the thing we had before, if we had here our template directly here directly inside the HTML. Yeah, that sure. At least I think that's what it says. But anyway, like this is like a super edge case. I don't think I'll ever try to even use in DOM templates. Modifiers. Modifiers are special post fixes denoted by a dot, which indicate that a directive should be bound in some special way. For example, the .prevent modifier tells the vOn directive to call event.prevent default on the triggered event, just like this. So we have a directive, which is a shorthand here, which is vOn. We have an attribute, which is the submit, and this will be the modifier. You'll see other examples of modifiers later from V1 and for V model when we explore those features. And finally, here's the full directive syntax visualized. Name starts with V, may be omitted when using shortcuts. Argument follows the colon or shortcut symbol. Modifier denoted by the leading dot, and then the value interpreted as JavaScript expression. Okay, let's do a pause and we'll continue some time later.